A school teacher notices her 7-year-old student flinching every time an adult approaches and hiding bruises under long sleeves. When she finally gains the child's trust and sees the photos hidden in his backpack, what she discovers about his stepfather makes her immediately call 911. The morning sky hung heavy and gray over Millbrook Elementary, pregnant with the promise of more snow. Margaret Thompson pulled her burgundy Honda Civic into the nearly empty faculty parking lot at 7:15, a full hour before the first bell would ring. The windshield wipers scraped against the accumulating flakes as she turned off the engine, their rhythmic squeal joining the symphony of winter sounds that had become Portland's soundtrack for the past 2 weeks. Margaret gathered her canvas tote bag, laptop case, and the thermal mug of coffee that had become her morning ritual since she started teaching 8 years ago. At 34, she had found her calling in these halls, in the organized chaos of second-grade minds discovering the world through books and numbers and endless questions. Her colleagues often teased her about arriving so early, but Margaret cherished these quiet moments before the building came alive with children's voices. The heavy glass doors of Millbrook Elementary yielded to her familiar push, and she stepped into the warmth of the main hallway. The school smelled of industrial cleaner and the faint aroma of yesterday's cafeteria lunch, a comforting blend that spoke of routine and safety. Her footsteps echoed against the polished linoleum as she made her way past the principal's office, where Mr. Harrison's light was already on, casting a warm glow through his partially open door. "Morning, Margaret," came his voice as she passed. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison. Another snow day brewing." She paused at his doorway, noting the way he squinted at his computer screen, probably reviewing weather updates and bus schedules. "Looks like it might be our last normal day for a while. The forecast shows another 6 inches by afternoon." He looked up from his screen, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that came from years of managing a school full of children whose safety depended on adult decisions. "I'll probably call it early if the roads get bad." Margaret nodded and continued down the hall toward room 204, her home away from home. The familiar brass nameplate beside her door read, "Miss Thompson's second grade." Though she had long since stopped correcting people who assumed the title meant something about her personal life, teaching had been her choice, her calling, and the relationships she built with her students filled spaces in her heart that romantic partnerships had never quite managed to occupy. She unlocked her classroom door and stepped into the sanctuary she had spent countless hours perfecting. 24 small desks arranged in clusters of 4, each group positioned to encourage collaboration while maintaining clear sightlines to the smartboard at the front of the room. The walls were covered with student artwork, a word wall featuring vocabulary they were learning, and a large calendar where they tracked the days and weather patterns together each morning. Margaret set her belongings on her desk and began her daily routine. She turned on the lights, adjusted the thermostat to a comfortable 72 degrees, and checked that the reading corner was properly arranged. The corner had been her addition to the standard classroom setup, a small area with a colorful rug, oversized pillows, and 2 low bookshelves filled with picture books and early readers. It was where magic happened, where reluctant readers discovered they could love stories, where shy children found their voices. As she prepared the day's materials, Margaret's mind wandered to her students, each of them unique personalities that she had come to know intimately over the past 5 months. There was Jessica, whose hand shot up for every question, even when she wasn't entirely sure of the answer. Tommy, who struggled with reading but had an intuitive understanding of math that astounded her. Priya, who was still learning English but expressed herself through remarkably detailed drawings that told complex stories. And then there was Benjamin Williams. Margaret paused in her preparation, her hands stilling on the stack of worksheets she was organizing. Benny had been one of her most engaged students at the beginning of the school year. His mixed heritage gave him distinctive features, his mother's delicate Asian bone structure combined with what she assumed were his father's broader build and lighter coloring. He had warm brown eyes that used to light up during story time, and a quick smile that revealed a missing front tooth he had lost in October. But that smile had become increasingly rare as the months progressed. Margaret couldn't pinpoint exactly when she first noticed the change. It had been gradual, subtle enough that she might have dismissed it as a phase if her years of experience hadn't taught her to pay attention to the small shifts in her students' behavior. Somewhere around the beginning of February, Benny had started choosing seats closer to the walls during group activities. His enthusiastic participation in discussions had given way to quiet nods and whispered responses. During recess, instead of joining the playground games with his usual energy, he often stood near the building, watching the other children play. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Other teachers were beginning to arrive, their voices creating a gentle murmur that would soon give way to the controlled chaos of a school day. Margaret glanced at the clock on her wall, 7:45. In 30 minutes, her students would begin filtering into the classroom, bringing with them their individual stories, struggles, and triumphs. She moved to the windows that lined one wall of her classroom, looking out at the school's playground where snow continued to fall in thick, lazy flakes. The swing sets stood empty, their chains moving slightly in the winter wind. By the time school ended, there would be enough snow for snowmen and snow angels, the kind of natural playground that turned ordinary children into architects of wonder. But even as she anticipated the joy that fresh snow would bring to most of her students, Margaret found herself thinking about Benny again. Would he participate in the snow games, or would he continue his pattern of standing apart, watching from the sidelines with those increasingly guarded eyes? Her concerns about Benny weren't based on any single incident, but rather on an accumulation of small observations that her professional instincts told her were significant. The way he positioned himself in corners during group work, always with his back to a wall. How he had stopped volunteering to read aloud, despite being one of the strongest readers in the class. The careful way he moved, as if he were constantly aware of his body in space, protecting himself from unexpected contact. Margaret had been teaching long enough to recognize the signs that something might be wrong in a child's life. She had seen it before, the gradual withdrawal, the hypervigilance, the way traumatized children seem to shrink into themselves as if trying to become invisible. But she had also learned to be careful about jumping to conclusions. Children went through phases, experienced stress from various sources, and sometimes what appeared to be concerning behavior had perfectly innocent explanations. Still, her instincts were rarely wrong. The sound of the first school bus pulling into the circular drive drew her attention back to the present moment. Through her windows, she could see bundled figures disembarking, children in puffy winter coats and colorful hats making their way toward the building. Soon, her classroom would be filled with wet boots, dripping mittens, and the excited chatter of children who had watched the snow fall during their bus rides to school. Margaret returned to her desk and pulled out her grade book, but instead of opening it to the day's lesson plans, she found herself flipping to the section where she kept notes about her students' progress and behavior. Her entry for Benjamin Williams had grown longer over the past few weeks, filled with observations that painted a picture of a child who was slowly disappearing into himself. Benny seemed hesitant to participate in group reading today. When I approached his desk to offer help with math, he startled visibly. During art class, Benny worked alone despite my encouragement to collaborate with his table partners. He keeps his arms close to his body, even when reaching for supplies. Benny declined to share during our weekend news time for the third week in a row. When I asked privately if everything was okay, he nodded but wouldn't make eye contact. Margaret closed the grade book as the first students began arriving at her classroom door. She stood and smoothed her navy cardigan, checking that her smile was in place, ready to greet each child with the warmth and enthusiasm that set the tone for their entire day. "Good morning, Jessica. I love your sparkly snow boots." She high-fived the energetic blonde girl who bounced into the classroom with her usual exuberance. "Miss Thompson, did you see how much snow there is? My mom said we might get to go home early." Jessica's eyes were bright with excitement as she hung her coat in her assigned cubby. "I did notice the snow. What do you think we should add to our weather chart today?" As more students arrived, Margaret maintained her cheerful demeanor while keeping one eye on the doorway, waiting for Benny's arrival. His mother typically dropped him off rather than having him ride the bus, something Margaret had noted because it meant he arrived after most of his classmates, often when the classroom was already bustling with activity. Tommy burst through the door next, his red hair sticking up at odd angles beneath his winter hat. "Miss Thompson, guess what? My dad said if we get enough snow, He's going to teach me how to build an igloo. That sounds like an exciting project, Tommy. Maybe you can tell us all about it during sharing time. More students filtered in Priya with her carefully braided hair and shy smile. Marcus carrying a book he was eager to finish. Emma already chattering about the snow day possibilities with her best friend Lily. Margaret greeted each one individually, filing away mental notes about their moods, their energy levels, any changes from their typical morning demeanor. At 8:10, 5 minutes before the final bell, Linda Chin-Williams appeared in the doorway with Benny at her side. Margaret felt her attention sharpen as she observed the interaction between mother and son. Linda looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from working night shifts and trying to maintain a normal schedule during the day. Her scrubs were visible beneath her open winter coat, and her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Have a good day, sweetheart," Linda said, bending down to give Benny a hug. "I'll see you this afternoon." Benny accepted the hug, but Margaret noticed how briefly he allowed the contact, how quickly he stepped away from his mother's embrace. Linda didn't seem to notice, already distracted by something on her phone, probably checking messages from work. "Good morning, Benny," Margaret said warmly as he approached his cubby. "I'm glad you made it before the snow gets too heavy." Benny looked up at her briefly, his brown eyes meeting hers for just a moment before he looked away. "Good morning, Miss Thompson." His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and Margaret noticed how he kept his movements small and controlled as he hung up his coat and backpack. Unlike the other children, who were animated and talkative after their snowy journey to school, Benny seemed to withdraw into himself as he settled at his desk. The final bell rang, and Margaret moved to the front of the classroom to begin their morning routine. "Good morning, class. Let's start by looking at our calendar and talking about the weather." As her students responded with enthusiasm, Margaret found herself watching Benny out of the corner of her eye. He was participating, but minimally nodding when appropriate, whispering responses that she had to strain to hear. When she asked who would like to update their weather chart, every hand shot up except his. They moved through their morning activities, journal writing, where students wrote about their thoughts and experiences, followed by their daily math warm-up. Margaret circulated through the classroom, offering encouragement and assistance, but she noticed that when she approached Benny's desk, he seemed to tense up. "How's your journal entry coming along, Benny?" she asked, crouching down beside his desk to bring herself to his eye level. He startled slightly at her proximity, his pencil freezing mid-word. "It's okay," he said, instinctively covering his paper with his arm. Margaret could see that he had written only 2 sentences about the snow, when typically his journal entries were among the most detailed in the class. "Would you like to tell me about what you're writing?" Benny shook his head quickly, his eyes focused on his desk rather than her face. "I'm not done yet." "That's fine. Take your time." Margaret stood and moved to the next student, but the interaction left her with a familiar tightness in her chest, the feeling she got when her professional instincts were telling her to pay closer attention. The morning progressed with their regular activities, but Margaret found herself creating mental notes about every interaction with Benny. During math time, when she demonstrated a new concept on the smartboard, he followed along but didn't ask questions even when she could see confusion in his expression. When they broke into pairs for a reading activity, he worked quietly with his partner but contributed little to their discussion. It was during their mid-morning break, when the children were getting drinks of water and stretching their legs, that Margaret observed something that made her concerns crystallize into genuine alarm. Mr. Harrison appeared in her doorway, his tall frame filling the entrance as he prepared to make an announcement about the potential early dismissal due to the worsening weather conditions. The children were scattered around the classroom, some sharpening pencils, others organizing their desks, the usual comfortable chaos of a brief break in the academic routine. "Excuse me, boys and girls," Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority that came with years of school administration. "I need to let you know that we're watching the weather very carefully today." Margaret watched as most of her students turned toward the principal with interest, their faces bright with the possibility of an unexpected early dismissal. But her attention was drawn to Benny, who had been reaching for his water bottle when Mr. Harrison's voice filled the room. The child's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His entire body went rigid, his shoulders drawing up toward his ears, as if he were trying to make himself smaller. His hand, which had been extended toward his water bottle, jerked back so quickly that he knocked over his pencil container, sending pencils clattering across his desk and onto the floor. But it was the look on his face that stopped Margaret's breath. Pure, instinctive fear. Not surprise, not embarrassment at making noise during an announcement, but the kind of deep, visceral fear that spoke of terrible experience with adult authority figures. The moment lasted only seconds. Benny quickly began gathering his scattered pencils. His movements hurried and precise, as if he were trying to erase any evidence that he had made a disturbance. But Margaret had seen enough. As Mr. Harrison finished his announcement and moved on to the next classroom, Margaret quietly made her way over to Benny's desk. He was still collecting pencils, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to organize them back into their container. "Here, let me help you with those," she said softly, kneeling down to pick up a pencil that had rolled under his chair. Benny looked up at her, and for just a moment, she saw something in his eyes that broke her heart. It was the look of a child who was expecting punishment, waiting for the blow to fall, prepared for pain that experience had taught him was inevitable. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly she almost didn't hear him. "I didn't mean to knock them over." "Benny," Margaret said gently, her voice warm with compassion, "you have nothing to be sorry for. Accidents happen. That's why we call them accidents." She handed him the pencil she had retrieved, making sure her movements were slow and non-threatening. "Are you okay?" He nodded quickly, but she could see that his hands were still trembling slightly as he placed the last pencil back in its container. "I'm fine." But Margaret knew he wasn't fine. The reaction she had witnessed wasn't normal childhood startlement. It was the response of a child who had learned to fear unexpected adult attention, who had been conditioned to expect negative consequences for even the smallest mistakes. As she stood and returned to the front of the classroom to continue their lesson, Margaret's mind was already working through the implications of what she had observed. Benny's gradual withdrawal, his hypervigilance, his positioning near walls and corners, and now this stark fear response to adult authority. The pieces were forming a picture that made her stomach clench with dread. She had seen this pattern before in other children in other years, but seeing it in Benny, whom she had watched transform from a bright, engaged student into a frightened, guarded child, made it personal in a way that professional experience couldn't quite prepare her for. Margaret continued teaching, guiding her students through their reading lesson, but part of her attention remained focused on Benny. She watched as he gradually relaxed, his shoulders slowly lowering from their defensive position, his breathing becoming less shallow. But the hypervigilance remained, the way his eyes would dart toward any unexpected sound, the careful way he positioned himself in his chair as if ready to respond to threat. When recess time arrived and the children began bundling up in their winter gear to play in the fresh snow, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Instead of using the break to grade papers or prepare for the afternoon lessons, she would observe. She would watch Benny with the systematic attention of a professional who suspected that a child in her care was in danger. Because that's what her instincts were telling her, with increasing clarity and growing urgency. Benjamin Chin Williams, 7 years old, bright and sweet and increasingly afraid, was in danger. And if that was true, then it was her responsibility not just as his teacher, but as the one adult in his life who saw him every day, who was in a position to notice the changes and document the signs, to figure out what was happening to him and how to help. As her students lined up at the door, excited chatter filling the air as they anticipated playing in the snow, Margaret caught Benny's eye and smiled at him. For just a moment, he smiled back, a ghost of the bright expression she remembered from the beginning of the school year. But behind that brief smile, she could see the fear that had taken up residence in those warm brown eyes. And Margaret Thompson, veteran teacher and fierce protector of children, made a silent promise that she would not let this child's suffering continue in silence. The snow continued to fall outside the classroom windows, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside room 204, Margaret was beginning to uncover something much darker. Something that would test every skill she had developed in 8 years of teaching and demand courage she had never known she possessed. Winter in Portland was just beginning, But for Benny Chin-Williams, the season of silence was about to end. The snow had continued falling throughout the morning, and by lunchtime, Mr. Harrison's prediction proved accurate. The announcement came over the intercom at 11:30. School would dismiss at 1 o'clock to allow students and staff to get home safely before the roads became impassable. Margaret watched her students' faces light up with excitement at the prospect of an unexpected afternoon of freedom. Snow days were magical for children. She had learned over her years of teaching, transforming ordinary Wednesday afternoons into adventures filled with sledding, snowmen, and hot chocolate. But as she observed Benny's reaction to the early dismissal announcement, she noticed something that made her chest tighten with concern. While his classmates cheered and began chattering about their snow day plans, Benny's face remained carefully neutral. If anything, he seemed to withdraw further into himself, his shoulders hunching slightly as if he were bracing against something unpleasant. "All right, class," Margaret said, clapping her hands gently to regain their attention. "I know you're excited about going home early, but we still have time for our writing lesson before lunch. Let's focus on our work so we can finish strong." She had made a deliberate decision that morning to pay closer attention to Benny's behavior, and the early dismissal actually provided her with an unexpected opportunity. With a shortened day, she could observe him more intensively during their remaining time together, and perhaps find a moment for one-on-one interaction that might help her understand what was troubling him. As her students settled into their writing time, Margaret moved around the classroom with practiced ease, offering encouragement and guidance. But her route was carefully planned to bring her past Benny's desk several times, allowing her to observe him without making her attention obvious. What she saw during those casual pass-bys confirmed her growing concerns. Benny held his pencil in a death grip, his knuckles white with tension as he formed letters on his paper. His posture was rigid, almost defensive, and she noticed that he kept his non-writing arm close to his body, as if protecting his torso from some anticipated contact. When she finally approached his desk directly, crouching down to his level as she had done hundreds of times with hundreds of students over the years, his reaction was immediate and telling. He instinctively shifted away from her, not far enough to be obvious to other students, but enough that she could see his discomfort with adult proximity. "How's your story coming along, Benny?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle and non-threatening. "It's okay," he replied, his standard response to most of her questions lately. But as he spoke, he made a movement that caught Margaret's trained eye. He tugged at the sleeve of his long-sleeved shirt, pulling it down to ensure it covered his wrist completely. The gesture was subtle, automatic, the kind of unconscious behavior that spoke of habit rather than conscious thought. But it sent a chill down Margaret's spine, because she had seen that same protective gesture from other children who had something to hide beneath their clothing. "Would you like to read me what you've written so far?" she offered, settling more comfortably beside his desk. Benny hesitated, then began reading in his quiet voice. The snow was falling on the playground. All the kids wanted to play outside, but it was too cold. They had to stay inside and look out the windows. His story was shorter than usual, lacking the creative details that had once characterized his writing. But what struck Margaret wasn't what he had written, but how he held the paper. His left hand gripped the edge of the worksheet, and as he adjusted his position, his sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a glimpse of his wrist. What Margaret saw in that brief moment made her breath catch in her throat. Dark marks, unmistakably finger-shaped, circled Benny's thin wrist like a twisted bracelet. The bruises were in various stages of healing, some fresh and dark purple, others fading to yellow-green, suggesting a pattern of repeated injury over time. Benny noticed her gaze and immediately tugged his sleeve down again, his face flushing with what looked like shame. The movement was so quick, so practiced, that Margaret realized this wasn't the first time he had needed to conceal those marks. "Benny," she said softly, her heart breaking for this child who was clearly suffering in silence. "If you ever need to talk to someone about anything at all, you know I'm here for you, right?" He nodded quickly, but wouldn't meet her eyes. "I know, Miss Thompson." Margaret wanted to ask direct questions about the bruises, about what was happening at home, about who was hurting him. But her training held her back. Approaching suspected abuse cases required delicacy, documentation, and following proper protocols. Moving too quickly or asking the wrong questions could potentially make things worse for the child. Instead, she squeezed his shoulder gently, noting how he tensed at the contact, and moved on to the next student. But her mind was racing, processing what she had seen and what it might mean. As the morning progressed toward lunch, Margaret found herself creating opportunities to observe Benny more closely. During their math lesson, when students were working with manipulatives that required reaching and moving, she watched his body language carefully. He moved with a deliberate caution that was unusual for a 7-year-old, as if he were constantly aware of potential pain in his torso or limbs. When Tommy accidentally bumped into Benny while returning supplies to the shelf, Margaret saw Benny wince and instinctively protect his ribs with his arm. The collision had been minor, the kind of brief contact that happened dozens of times each day in a classroom full of energetic children. But Benny's reaction suggested that even light impact caused him discomfort. Margaret made a mental note to start documenting these observations more systematically. If her suspicions were correct, if someone was physically abusing Benny, then she would need detailed records of everything she noticed. The legal system required evidence, and her observations might be crucial in protecting this child. Lunchtime arrived, and Margaret walked her students to the cafeteria, but she made sure to position herself where she could continue observing Benny's behavior. The cafeteria was bustling with excitement about the early dismissal, children chattering loudly about their snow day plans while they ate their meals. Benny sat at his usual table, but Margaret noticed that he barely touched his food. He pushed his sandwich around on his tray, took a few sips of milk, but seemed to have little appetite. When one of his tablemates, Marcus, reached across to grab a napkin, Benny automatically moved back, creating space between himself and the other child. The protective behavior was becoming more obvious the more Margaret watched for it. Benny was unconsciously positioning himself to avoid unexpected contact, maintaining distance from his peers, always keeping his back to walls or corners when possible. These weren't the behaviors of a normally developing 7-year-old. They were the survival mechanisms of a child who had learned to expect harm. After lunch, as Margaret led her class back to their classroom for the final hour before early dismissal, she made a decision that would formalize her growing concerns. She would begin keeping detailed written records of her observations, and she would reach out to the school counselor for guidance on how to proceed. The afternoon lesson was supposed to be art class, a favorite activity for most of her students. Margaret had planned a winter-themed project that involved cutting, gluing, and painting activities that typically generated enthusiasm and creative energy. But as she watched Benny during the art lesson, she gathered more disturbing evidence of what might be happening to him. When she distributed the art supplies, Benny accepted his materials with quiet thanks, but she noticed how he organized them on his desk. Everything was arranged with precise care, as if disorder might have consequences. When other children reached across the table to share supplies, Benny would hand over what they needed, rather than allowing them to reach into his space. The most revealing moment came when they were working with glue sticks. The activity required students to roll up their sleeves to avoid getting glue on their clothing. Margaret watched as every child in the class automatically pushed their sleeves up to their elbows, except for Benny. He glanced around nervously, noting that everyone else had bare forearms, then made a show of rolling up just one sleeve while keeping the other pulled down. When Margaret approached to help him with his project, she could see why. His exposed forearm showed finger-shaped bruises similar to what she had glimpsed on his wrist, but these were darker, more recent. The marks suggested that someone had gripped his arm tightly enough to leave deep bruises, possibly while restraining or moving him forcefully. But it was his covered arm that made Margaret's stomach clench with dread. Even beneath the fabric of his shirt, she could see the outline of what appeared to be a larger bruise on his upper arm, the kind of mark that might result from being grabbed or shaken. "Benny," she said quietly, kneeling beside his desk while the other children were focused on their projects. "Did you hurt your arm somehow?" His reaction was immediate and telling. His eyes went wide with what looked like panic, and he quickly pulled his sleeve down to cover the bruises completely. "I fell," he said quickly, the words tumbling out as if he had rehearsed them. I fell down the stairs at home. I'm clumsy sometimes. Margaret had heard variations of this explanation before, from other children in other years who had shown up to school with suspicious injuries. The response was too quick, too practiced, and it didn't match the pattern of bruising she had observed. Falls downstairs typically resulted in bruises on knees, elbows, and shins, places where a tumbling child would make contact with steps. They didn't typically cause the kind of grip marks around wrists and arms that she had seen on Benny. Those bruises spoke of human hands, of someone grabbing and holding tight enough to leave lasting marks. I'm sorry you got hurt, Margaret said gently, not challenging his explanation but letting him know she cared about his well-being. If you ever want to talk about anything that's bothering you, I'm always here to listen. Benny nodded but turned his attention back to his art project, effectively ending the conversation. Margaret stood and moved on to help other students, but her mind was working through the implications of what she had seen and heard. The pattern was becoming clear, and it painted a disturbing picture. The bruises in various stages of healing suggested ongoing abuse rather than a single incident. The finger-shaped marks indicated that someone was grabbing Benny forcefully and repeatedly. His rehearsed explanation about falling suggested that he had been coached on what to say if anyone noticed his injuries. Most troubling of all was the fear she had seen in his eyes when she asked about his arm. It wasn't the embarrassment of a clumsy child who had taken a tumble. It was the terror of a child who knew that talking about his injuries might lead to worse consequences. Margaret glanced at the clock on her classroom wall. 20 minutes until dismissal. 20 minutes before Benny would leave the safety of her classroom and return to whatever situation was causing those bruises. The thought made her feel physically sick. As the art lesson concluded and her students began cleaning up their supplies, Margaret made her way to her desk and pulled out a composition notebook that she kept for various classroom notes. But instead of writing about lesson plans or student progress, she began documenting what she had observed about Benny's condition. February 12th. Observed finger-shaped bruising around B's left wrist during writing time. Marks appear to be in various stages of healing, suggesting repeated incidents. B exhibited protective behavior when questioned, immediately covering marks and providing rehearsed explanation about falling downstairs. She continued writing, recording every detail she could remember from the past few weeks of observations. Benny's withdrawal from social activities, his hypervigilance around adults, his careful positioning near walls and corners, his fearful reaction to Mr. Harrison's unexpected appearance in the classroom. The dismissal announcement came over the intercom, and Margaret's students began gathering their belongings with the excited energy that came with an unexpected early release. But as she watched parents and caregivers beginning to arrive for pickup, Margaret felt a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Benny's mother typically picked him up, but Margaret knew that Linda worked night shifts and might not be available for the early dismissal. If David Williams came to collect Benny instead, Margaret would have her first opportunity to observe the man she was beginning to suspect might be responsible for the bruises hidden beneath her students' clothing. As children were called for pickup, Margaret positioned herself near the classroom door where she could see the main hallway and observe the interactions between her students and their families. She watched Jessica run excitedly toward her grandmother, saw Tommy high-five his father as they discussed igloo building plans, observed the warm hugs and cheerful conversations that characterized normal family pickup routines. When Benny's name was called over the intercom, Margaret felt her attention sharpen. She watched as he gathered his backpack with the same careful precision she had observed all day, making sure his sleeves were pulled down to cover his wrists completely. "Have a good snow day, Benny," she said as he approached the door. "Thank you, Miss Thompson," he replied politely, but she could see tension in his small shoulders as he prepared to leave the classroom. Margaret followed him into the hallway, ostensibly to supervise the dismissal process but actually to observe his reunion with whoever had come to pick him up. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. David Williams stood near the main entrance, and even from a distance, Margaret could sense something unsettling about his presence. He was a large man, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of build that spoke of physical labor. His arms were crossed over his chest as he waited, and his expression was impatient, almost irritated. When Benny approached him, there was no warm greeting, no excitement about the unexpected early dismissal. David's eyes swept over the child with what looked like inspection rather than affection, and Margaret noticed how Benny seemed to shrink under that scrutiny. "About time," she heard David say as Benny reached him. "I had to leave work early for this nonsense." The words were spoken quietly, but the tone carried clearly enough for Margaret to hear the irritation and resentment. This wasn't a man who was happy to see his stepson. This was someone who viewed Benny's need for pickup as an inconvenience. As they walked toward the exit, Margaret observed their body language carefully. David walked slightly ahead, not adjusting his pace for Benny's shorter legs. The child had to hurry to keep up, his backpack bouncing against his small frame. There was no hand-holding, no protective arm around shoulders, none of the natural affection she typically saw between children and their caregivers. But what disturbed Margaret most was the way Benny positioned himself in relation to David. Even as they walked together, the child maintained distance, staying slightly behind and to the side, as if he were trying to remain outside of David's immediate reach. It was the behavior of someone who had learned to be cautious around this man, someone who had reason to fear unexpected contact. Just before they reached the exit, Margaret saw something that made her decision for her. David placed his hand on Benny's shoulder, ostensibly a normal gesture of guidance or affection. But she watched Benny's reaction, the immediate tensing of his entire body, the way he seemed to brace himself against the contact, the barely perceptible wince that suggested the touch was unwelcome or painful. The interaction lasted only seconds, but it told Margaret everything she needed to know. Benjamin Williams, 7 years old, was afraid of his stepfather. The bruises hidden beneath his clothing, the careful way he moved, the rehearsed explanations about falling, they all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. David Williams was abusing Benny, and the child was suffering in silence. As the heavy glass doors closed behind them and they disappeared into the swirling snow, Margaret stood in the hallway, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had suspected abuse before in her teaching career, had made reports to Child Protective Services when evidence warranted intervention. But this felt different, more personal, because she had watched the transformation happen gradually, had seen a bright, engaged child slowly disappear behind walls of fear and pain. Margaret returned to her empty classroom, her mind already working through what she needed to do next. Documentation was crucial. She would need to record every observation, every concerning behavior, every piece of evidence that might help build a case for intervention. She would need to consult with the school counselor and possibly the principal about proper procedures for reporting suspected abuse. But most importantly, she would need to find a way to reach Benny, to let him know that he wasn't alone, that there were adults who cared about him and wanted to help. Building that trust would take time, patience, and careful attention to his emotional state. Margaret sat at her desk and opened her notebook again, continuing the documentation she had started earlier. As snow continued to fall outside her windows, blanketing the world in deceptive purity, she wrote detailed descriptions of everything she had observed, creating a record that might someday help save a child's life. The early dismissal had given her unexpected insights into Benny's situation, but it had also sent him home hours earlier than usual to whatever was waiting for him in that house with David Williams. As she locked her classroom door and prepared to leave for her own snow day, Margaret couldn't shake the image of that small figure hurrying to keep up with a man who seemed to view him as a burden rather than a blessing. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin the delicate process of trying to reach Benjamin Williams, to let him know that someone had noticed his pain and was willing to help. Because if her suspicions were correct, this child desperately needed an advocate, someone who would fight for his safety and well-being. The snow continued to fall as Margaret drove home through the quiet streets of Portland, but her mind was already planning for the difficult conversations and decisions that lay ahead. Winter might be beautiful, but for some children, it was just another season of suffering that adults were responsible for ending. And Margaret Thompson had never been one to ignore that responsibility. The snow had stopped falling by Thursday morning, but Portland remained blanketed in a pristine layer of white that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical and serene. Margaret arrived at Millbrook Elementary even earlier than usual, her mind heavy with the decision she had made during the long, restless night following the early dismissal. She had spent hours researching child abuse recognition protocols, reviewing her professional training materials, and carefully documenting every observation she had made about Benny's condition. The evidence was mounting, but she knew that suspicion alone wasn't enough. If she was going to help this child, she needed to build a foundation of trust that would allow him to feel safe enough to share what was happening at home. Margaret unlocked her classroom door and stepped into the familiar space, but everything felt different now. The colorful bulletin boards and cheerful decorations seemed almost mockingly bright against the darkness of what she suspected was happening to one of her students. She had always prided herself on creating a safe haven for children, but now she realized that safety was more than just physical space. It was about emotional security, trust, and the knowledge that someone cared enough to notice when something was wrong. She made her way to the reading corner, the cozy space that had always been special to her students, and began rearranging it with deliberate purpose. She moved the pillows to create a more enclosed feeling, positioned the small lamp to cast warm, gentle light, and selected several books that she knew appealed to quiet, thoughtful children like Benny. If she was going to reach him, it would be here, in this space designed for intimacy and connection. Margaret pulled out her planning notebook and began sketching out a strategy for the day. She would need to create opportunities for one-on-one interaction with Benny without making it obvious to the other students that she was paying him special attention. Children were remarkably perceptive, and she didn't want to inadvertently put him in a position where he felt singled out or different from his classmates. Her first priority would be to establish herself as someone he could trust completely. That meant being consistent in her interactions, respectful of his boundaries, and patient with his need to control the pace of their relationship. Margaret had learned over her years of teaching that trust couldn't be rushed, especially with children who had been hurt by the adults who should have protected them. The sound of footsteps in the hallway signaled the arrival of her colleagues, and Margaret quickly shifted her focus to the normal preparations for the day. She checked her lesson plans, organized materials for their morning activities, and reviewed the schedule that would hopefully provide multiple opportunities for connection with Benny. At 7:45, the buses began arriving, and Margaret positioned herself near her classroom door to greet each student as they entered. She paid careful attention to their energy levels, their interactions with each other, and any signs that yesterday's snow day had affected their typical routines. Jessica bounced through the door with her usual enthusiasm, chattering excitedly about the snowman she had built with her grandmother. Tommy followed close behind, his red hair still bearing traces of the styling gel his mother used to tame his cowlicks, eager to share stories about the igloo construction project that had occupied his entire afternoon. But when Benny appeared in the doorway, Margaret felt her heart clench with concern. If anything, he looked more withdrawn than he had the previous day. His shoulders were hunched defensively, his eyes downcast, and he moved with the careful precision of someone who was trying very hard not to attract attention. "Good morning, Benny," Margaret said warmly, crouching down to his eye level as he approached his cubby. "How was your snow day?" He glanced up at her briefly, and she caught a glimpse of something that looked like exhaustion in his brown eyes. "It was okay," he said quietly, his standard response that she was beginning to recognize as a protective barrier. "Did you get to play in the snow at all?" she asked gently, noting how he kept his movements small and controlled as he hung up his backpack. Benny shook his head quickly. "I had to stay inside. David said it was too cold." The mention of his stepfather's name sent a chill through Margaret, but she kept her expression neutral and supportive. "Well, maybe we'll get to see the snow from our classroom windows today. Sometimes watching snow can be just as nice as playing in it." She saw the faintest hint of a smile cross his face before he looked away again. It was a small victory, but Margaret had learned to celebrate incremental progress when working with children who had been hurt. As the morning routine began, Margaret implemented the first part of her strategy. During their calendar time, when students typically raised their hands to volunteer answers, she made sure to call on Benny for questions she knew he could answer easily. When he correctly identified the day of the week, she offered genuine praise that was warm but not effusive enough to make him uncomfortable. "Thank you, Benny. You're absolutely right, it is Thursday." She watched his reaction carefully and was rewarded with a tiny nod of acknowledgement. Building confidence would be crucial to establishing trust, and she wanted him to associate their interactions with success rather than anxiety. During their morning writing time, Margaret made a calculated decision. Instead of moving randomly around the classroom as she usually did, she planned her route to bring her past Benny's desk several times, but she approached from angles that would allow him to see her coming. Surprise approaches seemed to trigger his defensive responses, so she wanted to give him the opportunity to prepare for their interactions. When she finally settled beside his desk, she noticed that he was writing about the snow day, but his story was notably different from those of his classmates. While other children wrote about building snowmen, having snowball fights, and drinking hot chocolate, Benny's account was sparse and careful. Yesterday it snowed a lot. School got out early. I went home and did my homework. The snow was pretty to look at through the window. The writing was technically proficient. Benny was one of the stronger writers in the class, but it lacked the personal details and emotional content that characterized healthy children's narratives about enjoyable experiences. Margaret made a mental note to add this observation to her growing documentation. "You're doing beautiful work with your handwriting, Benny," she said softly, genuinely impressed with the neat formation of his letters. "Would you like to tell me more about what the snow looked like from your window?" He considered her question carefully, as if weighing whether it was safe to share more information. "It was really white," he said finally, "and quiet. Everything was quiet." Margaret heard something in his tone that suggested the quiet might have been significant, perhaps a relief from sounds that were usually present in his home environment. But she didn't push for clarification, instead simply nodding with understanding. "Quiet can be nice sometimes," she agreed. "It gives us time to think and notice things we might miss when everything is noisy." The rest of the morning proceeded according to Margaret's carefully planned strategy. She created multiple opportunities for positive interaction with Benny while maintaining the normal classroom routine that provided security for all her students. During math time, she made sure to position herself where she could offer him subtle assistance without drawing attention from his peers. When they worked with manipulatives, she observed his continued careful movements, noting how he seemed to protect his torso and arms from accidental contact. Lunchtime provided Margaret with her next planned opportunity for connection. As her students lined up to go to the cafeteria, she made a casual announcement that had been designed specifically with Benny in mind. "Remember, if anyone would like to eat lunch in the classroom today, you're welcome to stay. Sometimes it's nice to have a quiet lunch break." Most of her students were eager to join their friends in the bustling cafeteria, but Margaret wasn't surprised when Benny hesitated at the back of the line. She had suspected that the noise and chaos of the lunchroom might be overwhelming for a child who was already hypervigilant and stressed. "Miss Thompson." Benny's voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "Could I maybe stay here for lunch?" "Of course," Margaret replied, as if his request were perfectly normal. "I was planning to eat in the classroom myself today. Would you like to keep me company?" She watched relief flood across his small face, and she knew she had made the right decision. Creating a safe space for him to choose quieter alternatives to overwhelming social situations would be another step in building the trust she desperately needed. As the other students headed to the cafeteria with the teaching assistant, Margaret and Benny found themselves alone in the classroom for the first time. Margaret had packed a simple lunch specifically for this possibility. A sandwich, some fruit, and a thermos of soup that would make the classroom feel more like home. She gestured toward the reading corner, which she had prepared earlier. "Would you like to eat over there? It's more comfortable than sitting at our desks." Benny nodded and retrieved his lunch bag from his cubby, moving toward the reading corner with the same careful precision she had observed in all his movements. Margaret followed with her own lunch, settling cross-legged on one of the large floor pillows while Benny chose a spot that positioned him with his back to the wall and a clear view of the classroom door. The positioning wasn't lost on Margaret. Even in this safe environment, Benny instinctively chose a location that would allow him to see potential threats approaching and provided a barrier behind him. It was the behavior of someone who had learned that danger could come from any direction, at any time. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes, Margaret respecting Benny's need to feel secure before attempting conversation. She had brought a picture book with her, one of her personal favorites about a small mouse who went on adventures in his neighborhood. and she placed it casually beside her where Benny could see the colorful cover. "This is one of my favorite books," she said conversationally, not directly offering to read it, but making it available if he showed interest. "I've probably read it 100 times, but I still notice new details in the pictures." Benny glanced at the book, and she saw a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "What kind of adventures does the mouse have?" Margaret felt a small surge of triumph. This was the first time in weeks that Benny had initiated a question about something other than schoolwork. "Well, he's very curious about the world around him, so he explores different places in his neighborhood. But he's also quite careful and smart about staying safe." She opened the book to a page that showed the mouse cautiously exploring a garden, taking care to stay hidden from larger animals that might pose a threat. It was a deliberate choice. She wanted Benny to see a character who was both brave and careful, someone who understood the importance of being cautious while still engaging with the world. "He looks small," Benny observed, moving slightly closer to get a better view of the illustrations. "He is small," Margaret agreed, "but he's also very observant and smart. He notices things that bigger animals might miss, and he's good at finding safe places to explore from." They looked through several pages together, Margaret reading softly while Benny followed along with the pictures. She noticed that he relaxed incrementally as they shared the story, his shoulders loosening and his breathing becoming less shallow. The simple act of sharing a book was creating the kind of positive association she hoped would encourage him to seek out more opportunities for connection. When they finished the story, Benny surprised her with another question. "Do you have other books about small animals who go on adventures?" "I do," Margaret said, delighted by his engagement. "Would you like me to bring some for you to look at? You could keep them in your desk if you want, for times when you finish your work early or just want something quiet to do." Benny nodded eagerly, the first truly enthusiastic response she had seen from him in weeks. "Could I really keep them in my desk?" "Absolutely. I think it's important for everyone to have special books that make them feel happy and safe." The use of the word safe was deliberate, part of Margaret's strategy to help Benny begin associating her and the classroom with security and protection. She wanted him to understand that there were places and people in his world where he didn't need to be constantly vigilant. As lunchtime drew to a close, Margaret made another strategic decision. Instead of immediately transitioning back to academic activities, she offered Benny a choice that would help her gauge his comfort level with their developing relationship. "Benny, would you like to help me organize the classroom library this afternoon? I've been meaning to sort through some of the books and make sure they're all in the right places. It's the kind of job that's more fun with a helper." The offer served multiple purposes. It would give them more time together in a structured but relaxed setting, allow her to continue observing his behavior and emotional state, and provide him with a sense of purpose and contribution that might boost his self-esteem. "I could help," Benny said quietly, but Margaret could hear genuine interest in his voice. "I'm good at organizing things." "I bet you are," Margaret replied warmly. "We can work on it after we finish our science lesson." The afternoon proceeded according to Margaret's carefully orchestrated plan. During their science lesson about weather patterns, she made sure to include Benny in discussions about the snow they had observed, drawing connections between their classroom learning and his real-world experiences. When they transitioned to their library organization project, she watched with interest as Benny approached the task with methodical precision. He sorted books by size, then by subject, creating neat piles that demonstrated both his intellectual capabilities and his need for order and control. Margaret worked alongside him, organizing books of her own while maintaining casual conversation that gradually encouraged him to share more about his interests and preferences. "I like books about animals," Benny said as he carefully arranged a stack of picture books about wildlife, "especially small animals that are smart." "What do you think makes an animal smart?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Benny considered the question seriously. "They know how to stay safe, and they pay attention to what's happening around them, and they don't trust everyone right away." Margaret felt her heart clench at his response. Even in discussing fictional animals, Benny was revealing his own survival strategies and worldview. The idea that intelligence was primarily about safety and vigilance spoke to a childhood where those qualities had been necessary for survival. Those are very important kinds of intelligence, Margaret agreed. Being observant and careful can definitely help animals and people stay safe. As they continued working together, Margaret noticed that Benny was beginning to relax in ways she hadn't seen since the beginning of the school year. His movements became less rigid. He made occasional eye contact, and once or twice she caught him humming quietly under his breath while he worked. The afternoon drew to a close, and Margaret knew that pickup time would soon separate them again. She had made significant progress in building trust with Benny, but she was also acutely aware that he would soon be returning to whatever situation had caused the bruises she had observed the day before. As her students began gathering their belongings, Margaret made a decision that she hoped would provide Benny with some continuity of connection even when they were apart. "Benny," she said quietly, approaching his desk as he packed his backpack. "I have something for you." She handed him a small paper bag that contained 3 picture books she had selected specifically for him. Stories about small, clever animals who overcame challenges through intelligence and courage rather than size or strength. "These are for you to keep," she said. "I thought you might enjoy reading them at home, and you can tell me about them tomorrow if you want to." Benny's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like wonder. "For me to keep? Really? Really? I think everyone should have books that belong just to them." He clutched the bag against his chest, and Margaret saw tears forming in his eyes. The simple gift seemed to have touched something deep inside him, some need for kindness and individual attention that hadn't been met in far too long. "Thank you, Miss Thompson," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll take really good care of them." "I know you will," Margaret replied, gently touching his shoulder in the brief, careful way that she had learned he could tolerate. "And remember, if you ever want to talk about anything, the books or school, or anything at all, I'm always here to listen." The pickup announcement came over the intercom, and Margaret watched with now familiar anxiety as Benny prepared to leave the safety of her classroom. But today felt different. He moved with slightly more confidence, clutching his bag of books as if they were precious treasures, and when he said goodbye, he actually looked directly at her face. "See you tomorrow, Miss Thompson." "See you tomorrow, Benny. Have a good evening." As he walked toward the door, Margaret felt cautiously optimistic about the progress they had made. Building trust was a slow process, especially with a child who had been hurt, but she had seen glimpses today of the bright, engaged boy Benny had been before whatever was happening at home had begun to change him. Margaret returned to her desk and opened her documentation notebook, recording the day's observations and interactions. The trust-building process had begun, but she knew it was only the first step in what might be a long and difficult journey toward helping this child find safety and healing. Tomorrow, she decided, she would continue the patient work of showing Benny that there were adults in the world who could be trusted, who would listen without judgment, and who cared enough to notice when something was wrong. Because somewhere in that small bag of books, and in the careful attention she had shown him throughout the day, were the seeds of hope that might eventually grow into the courage he would need to share his terrible secret. The winter afternoon was growing dark outside her classroom windows, but Margaret felt warmer than she had in days. Trust was being built, one small interaction at a time, and that trust might someday save a child's life. Friday morning arrived with the promise of warmer weather, as the February sun emerged from behind the persistent cloud cover that had dominated Portland's skies for the past week. Margaret entered her classroom with a sense of cautious optimism, buoyed by the progress she had made with Benny the previous day. The trust-building process was delicate work, but she felt confident that she was creating the kind of safe environment that might eventually allow him to share whatever was troubling him. She had spent the evening selecting additional books for Benny, stories that featured characters who faced challenges with courage and resilience. Margaret believed deeply in the power of literature to help children process difficult emotions and situations, and she wanted to provide him with as many positive examples as possible of characters who found ways to overcome adversity. The small basket of carefully chosen books sat on her desk, waiting for the right moment to be shared. As she arranged her morning materials, Margaret reflected on the subtle changes she had observed in Benny during their time together yesterday. The way he had relaxed during their shared lunch, his genuine enthusiasm about the books she had given him, and most importantly, the brief moments when she had seen glimpses of the bright, curious child he had been before the fear took hold. These small victories felt monumental when measured against the backdrop of his obvious suffering. The morning routine proceeded smoothly, with Margaret maintaining the gentle, consistent approach that seemed to help Benny feel secure. She had learned to read his moods in the tiny details, the set of his shoulders as he hung up his backpack, the way he positioned himself at his desk, the careful manner in which he organized his school supplies. Today, she noticed something different about his demeanor. He seemed more alert, more present, but also carrying a kind of nervous energy that suggested he was wrestling with an important decision. During their opening circle time, Margaret observed that Benny was carrying his backpack differently today, clutching it closer to his body, as if protecting something precious or dangerous inside. She had initially assumed he had brought the books she had given him, perhaps wanting to show her that he had taken good care of them as promised. But as the morning progressed, she began to sense that whatever he was guarding so carefully held much greater significance. Their morning lessons flowed naturally from one activity to the next, with Margaret creating multiple opportunities for positive interaction with Benny while maintaining the normal classroom environment that provided stability for all her students. During their reading group, she was pleased to see him participate more actively than he had in weeks, even volunteering to read a paragraph aloud when she asked for volunteers. His voice was still quiet, still careful, but there was a subtle strength in it that hadn't been there before. The breakthrough in trust they had achieved yesterday seemed to have given Benny a foundation of confidence that was allowing him to engage more fully with his learning. Margaret watched as he worked through a challenging math problem, noting the way he approached it methodically rather than with the anxious rushing that had characterized his recent academic work. It was as if knowing that someone cared about him, someone was paying attention to his well-being, had freed up emotional energy that could now be directed toward learning. But beneath this newfound engagement, Margaret could sense an undercurrent of something else, a tension that suggested Benny was building up courage for something significant. She had seen this pattern before in her years of teaching, the way children sometimes gathered their strength before sharing something important or difficult. Every instinct she had developed through years of working with traumatized children told her that Benny was preparing to take a major step, and she wanted to be ready to support him when that moment arrived. It was during their mid-morning activity time, when students were working independently on a creative writing assignment about their favorite winter memories, that the moment Margaret had been building toward finally arrived. She had chosen this assignment deliberately, knowing that it would create natural opportunities for individual conferences with students while giving her the privacy she might need if Benny decided to share something significant. As she moved around the classroom, Margaret kept one eye on Benny's progress with the writing assignment. She had learned to recognize the signs when he was struggling with schoolwork, the way his pencil would hover over the paper, the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful way he would glance around the classroom as if seeking reassurance. Today, however, his struggle seemed different. Instead of the usual difficulty with academic content, he appeared to be wrestling with something more personal, more emotional. Margaret watched as he started to write, then stopped, erased what he had written, and started again. The pattern repeated several times, each false start accompanied by increasing signs of distress. His breathing became more shallow, his grip on his pencil tightened until his knuckles showed white, and she could see the internal battle he was fighting reflected in the tension of his small body. The other students in the class were engaged in their own writing, sharing quiet conversations about sledding adventures and hot chocolate by the fireplace, their voices creating a gentle background hum that would provide privacy for whatever conversation might unfold. Margaret had learned to orchestrate these moments carefully, creating spaces within the normal classroom routine where vulnerable children could feel safe enough to speak. After watching Benny struggle for several more minutes, Margaret made her way over to his desk, moving slowly and deliberately so he could see her approach. She had learned that unexpected movements or sudden appearances could trigger his defensive responses, so she always made sure to give him time to prepare for their interactions. When she settled beside him, she noticed immediately that his hands were trembling slightly as he held his pencil, and there were tears gathering in the corners of his eyes that he was trying desperately to hide. "How's your story coming along, Benny?" she asked gently. her voice barely above a whisper to ensure their conversation remained private from the other students who were scattered around the classroom working on their own assignments. "I don't know what to write," he said, his voice thick with emotion that he was struggling to control. "I can't think of any good winter memories." Margaret felt her heart break a little at his confession. The assignment that should have been a joyful reflection on seasonal pleasures had become a painful reminder of what was missing from his life. While his classmates were writing about sledding adventures, hot chocolate by the fireplace, and building snow forts with friends, Benny was confronting the reality that his recent winter experiences held no joy, no warmth, no safety to remember with fondness. "That's okay," Margaret said softly, her voice filled with the compassion that had made her a refuge for troubled children throughout her teaching career. "Sometimes it takes time to think of the right memory to share. And sometimes the memories that feel good to us aren't always the obvious ones. Would it help if we talked about what makes a memory feel good to remember?" Benny looked up at her with such naked vulnerability that Margaret had to take a steadying breath. In his brown eyes, she could see the weight of secrets too heavy for a 7-year-old to carry, the exhaustion of pretending that everything was normal when his world was filled with fear and pain. But she could also see something else, a desperate hope that maybe, finally, someone might be able to help him. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice barely audible even in the quiet of their corner conversation. "Can I tell you something? But it has to be a secret." This was the moment Margaret had been working toward, the breakthrough that might finally allow her to understand what was happening in Benny's life and take the steps necessary to protect him. But she also knew that she needed to be honest with him about the limitations of confidentiality when a child's safety was at stake. Her professional training had taught her that promises of absolute secrecy could sometimes prevent children from getting the help they desperately needed. "Benny, you can always talk to me about anything that's bothering you," she said carefully, choosing her words with the precision that came from years of experience with these delicate situations. "I care about you very much, and I want to help if I can. But if someone is hurting you or if you're in danger, I might need to talk to other grown-ups who can help keep you safe. Those grown-ups would be people whose job it is to protect children, and they would all be working together to help you. Do you understand?" Benny's face went pale at her words, and for a moment Margaret was afraid he would retreat back into his protective silence, that the fragile trust they had built over the past few days would crumble under the weight of his fear. She watched as he wrestled with the decision, seeing the internal battle between his desperate need for help and his terror of the consequences that David had undoubtedly threatened would follow any disclosure. But then something shifted in his expression, a kind of resolution that spoke of a child who had reached the absolute limits of what he could bear alone. Margaret recognized that look from other children she had helped over the years, the moment when the pain of keeping a secret became greater than the fear of revealing it. "I found something at home," he whispered, glancing around to make sure no other students were listening to their conversation. "Something that David hides in his workshop. I don't understand what it means, but it scared me, and I thought maybe if a grown-up saw it, they would know what to do." Margaret felt her pulse quicken, adrenaline beginning to course through her system as she sensed they were approaching something significant. But she kept her expression calm and supportive, knowing that any sign of alarm or distress from her might cause Benny to shut down again. "What did you find, Benny?" Instead of answering with words, Benny reached into his backpack with movements that were careful and deliberate, as if he were handling something both precious and dangerous. He pulled out a manila folder that had been carefully tucked between his notebooks, hidden from casual view but accessible when he finally found the courage to share its contents. His hands were shaking more noticeably now, and Margaret could see the enormous effort it was taking for him to overcome his fear and trust her with whatever was inside that folder. She could sense that this moment represented a culmination of days or perhaps weeks of internal struggle, a decision that had required every ounce of courage this traumatized child could muster. "I found this hidden in a box in David's workshop," Benny said, his voice barely audible as he struggled to find the words to explain what he had discovered. "I wasn't supposed to be down there, but I heard strange sounds one night when Mom was at work, and I got scared and went a look. There were lots of these pictures, but I could only take a few without him noticing." Margaret felt a chill of foreboding as she realized they were about to cross a threshold that would change everything. Whatever was in that folder had been significant enough to drive this frightened child to take enormous risks in obtaining it and even greater risks in bringing it to school to share with her. Benny's hands were trembling so badly that he couldn't seem to manage the simple task of opening the folder properly. Margaret could see the frustration and fear warring in his expression as he struggled with something that should have been easy but had become monumentally difficult under the weight of his emotional distress. "It's okay, Benny," Margaret said gently, placing her hand over his to help steady him while being careful not to take control away from him entirely. This was his choice, his moment of courage, and she wanted him to maintain agency over the process even while providing the support he needed. "You're being incredibly brave by telling me about this. Whatever these pictures show, you did exactly the right thing by bringing them to someone you trust." With Margaret's steadying presence helping him, Benny managed to open the folder completely, revealing 4 digital photographs that made Margaret's blood turn to ice in her veins. Even with all her years of experience, all her training in recognizing signs of abuse, nothing could have prepared her for the stark brutality of what she was looking at. The images were clear, well-lit, and devastating in their implications. They showed Benny in various states of distress and injury, with David Williams clearly visible in each frame, apparently documenting what could only be described as systematic abuse over an extended period of time. The professional quality of the photographs, the deliberate staging, and the calculated nature of the documentation revealed a level of premeditation and sadism that made Margaret feel physically sick. The first photograph showed Benny cowering against a wall in what appeared to be David's basement workshop, his small body pressed against the concrete as if trying to disappear into it. David stood over him, his face twisted with an expression of cruel satisfaction as he held what appeared to be a leather belt. The child's eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down his face, while David's posture suggested he was savoring the moment. The timestamp in the corner indicated it had been taken just 3 weeks ago, during a weekend when Linda would have been working her night shift at the hospital. The second image was even more disturbing, showing Benny with visible bruises on his arms, face, and what appeared to be his torso, while David positioned himself next to the injured child like someone posing with a trophy. David's expression in this photograph was particularly chilling, a smile of genuine pleasure, as if he were celebrating the harm he had inflicted. The casual nature of his pose, the way he seemed to be enjoying the documentation process, suggested a level of calculated sadism that went far beyond impulsive violence. The third photograph appeared to have been taken using a timer or remote, showing both David and Benny in the workshop setting. Benny was tied to a chair with rope, his face streaked with tears and his eyes wide with terror, while David stood behind him holding what appeared to be a camera timer remote. The workshop around them was clearly visible, revealing details that would later prove crucial for law enforcement. The specific location, the equipment David used, and the organized nature of his documentation system. But it was the fourth photograph that made Margaret realize the true scope of what they were dealing with, and the level of danger that Benny faced every day. This image showed David's workshop in more comprehensive detail, revealing a tripod-mounted camera, professional lighting equipment, and what appeared to be a computer setup specifically designed for editing and storing digital images. On a desk in the background, Margaret could see stacks of printed photographs and what looked like organized file folders, suggesting that David's documentation of abuse was extensive, systematic, and had been ongoing for a considerable period of time. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow to her chest. This wasn't just domestic abuse, as horrifying as that would have been. This was systematic documentation of child torture, methodically planned and executed, possibly for David's own psychological gratification or potentially for distribution to others with similar interests. The professional quality of the setup, the organized storage system, and the calculated nature of the documentation suggested that David had been engaged in this behavior for some time, and that his abuse of Benny might be part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior. Margaret struggled to maintain her composure as the full implications of what she was seeing began to register. The photographs represented not just evidence of abuse, but documentation of psychological torture designed to terrorize Benny into silence while providing David with a permanent record of his crimes. The technical sophistication of the setup suggested someone who had planned this carefully, who had invested time and resources into creating a system for documenting and preserving evidence of child abuse. Benny, Margaret managed to say, her voice carefully controlled despite the horror she was feeling and the rage that was building inside her toward the man who had done these things to this innocent child. You were absolutely right to bring these to me. This is exactly the kind of thing that grown-ups need to know about so we can help keep you safe. Benny looked up at her with eyes that held far too much knowledge for a 7-year-old child. Eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness, much less experience personally. I knew it was bad, he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of secrets that had been eating away at him for months. David told me that what happens in his workshop is our special secret, and that if I ever told anyone, something terrible would happen to Mom and me. But I saw how you looked at the other kids, how you smiled at them and helped them, and I thought maybe you could help me too. Margaret felt tears threatening to overwhelm her. But she knew that maintaining her composure was crucial for Benny's sense of safety and security. He needed to see strength and competence from her, not the emotional breakdown that the situation certainly warranted. She had to be his anchor in this moment, the steady adult presence that would help him navigate through the storm that was about to engulf his young life. You did exactly the right thing by trusting me with this, Benny, Margaret said with fierce conviction, meaning every word with the full force of her professional commitment and personal affection for this brave child. I promise you that I'm going to make sure you're safe, and that David can never hurt you again. What you've shown me gives us exactly what we need to make sure the right people can help you. She looked at the photographs again, this time with the analytical eye of someone who understood that these images would become crucial evidence in a criminal case. The timestamps showed that the abuse had been ongoing for months, with the most recent image dated just 1 week ago. The professional nature of David's documentation setup suggested this was far more than impulsive violence. It was calculated, organized, and deeply disturbing evidence of systematic child abuse that had been planned and executed with terrifying precision. Benny, I need to ask you something important, Margaret said gently, knowing that the answer to her next question would be crucial for understanding the full scope of what David had been doing to this child. Has David ever shown these pictures to you, or talked to you about them? Benny nodded miserably, fresh tears beginning to flow as he was forced to relive the psychological torture that had accompanied the physical abuse. Sometimes he makes me look at them, he said, his voice breaking with the weight of the confession. He says they're reminders of what happens when I don't follow the rules, and that if I ever tell anyone about our special time in the workshop, he'll show them to everyone at school. He said no one would want to be friends with a kid who let those things happen to him. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical abuse, Margaret realized with growing horror. David had been using the photographs not just to document his crimes for his own gratification, but as weapons of psychological control, terrorizing Benny into silence by making the child believe that he was somehow complicit in his own abuse and that exposure would bring shame rather than help. Margaret looked around her classroom, noting that her students were still focused on their writing assignments, their innocent chatter about winter memories creating a surreal counterpoint to the life-changing conversation happening just a few feet away from them. The normalcy of the classroom environment, the ordinary sounds of children engaged in learning, made the horror of what she had just discovered feel even more stark and urgent. She needed to take immediate action, but she also needed to ensure that Benny felt supported and protected throughout whatever was about to unfold. The next few hours would be crucial for his physical safety and his long-term psychological well-being, and every decision she made needed to be calculated to provide him with the best possible outcome. Benny, what you've shown me is very serious, and it means that some other grown-ups are going to need to get involved to make sure you're safe, Margaret explained carefully, choosing her words to be honest while also being age-appropriate for a traumatized 7-year-old. I'm going to need to call some people who help children in situations like yours. It might feel scary, but I promise that I'll be with you every step of the way, and that everyone who gets involved will be there to help you, not to hurt you. Benny's eyes filled with fresh tears, but he nodded with a maturity that broke Margaret's heart all over again. This child had been forced to grow up far too quickly, to understand concepts of violence and betrayal that should never touch a 7-year-old's world. Are you going to call the police? Yes, I am, Margaret said with complete honesty, knowing that trust required truth even when that truth was frightening. The police have special people who are trained to help children who have been hurt, and they'll know exactly what to do to make sure David can't hurt you anymore. They're good people, Benny, people whose job it is to protect children like you. She reached for her desk drawer and pulled out her cell phone, her hands surprisingly steady despite the enormity of what she was about to do. Margaret had made calls to Child Protective Services before in her teaching career, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of this moment, the knowledge that the next few minutes would set in motion a chain of events that would fundamentally change a child's life. But before she could dial, Benny grabbed her arm with a desperation that spoke of his deepest fears, the terrors that David had planted in his mind through months of psychological manipulation and threats. "What about my mom?" he asked, tears streaming down his face as he voiced the fear that had kept him silent for so long. David said that if anyone ever found out about the workshop, something bad would happen to her too. He said it would be my fault if she got hurt because I couldn't keep our secret. I don't want her to get hurt because of me. Margaret knelt down so she was at Benny's eye level, looking directly into his frightened brown eyes with all the authority and compassion that 8 years of teaching had given her. This was perhaps the most important thing she would ever say to a child, and she needed him to believe every word. "Benny, listen to me very carefully," she said with quiet intensity. "Nothing that David did to you was your fault. Not even a little bit. You are a child, and it's the job of grown-ups to keep you safe, not the other way around. David told you those things to scare you and keep you quiet, but they weren't true. You didn't do anything wrong, and you're not responsible for protecting your mom from David's actions." She paused, making sure he was absorbing her words before continuing with the reassurance he desperately needed to hear. "Your mom loves you, and when she finds out what's been happening, she's going to be proud of how brave you were to ask for help. She's going to understand that you did exactly what you should have done." Margaret reached out and gently took his hands in hers, noting how small and fragile they felt. How impossible it seemed that these little hands had found the courage to gather evidence that would bring down a dangerous predator. "The people I'm going to call are experts at handling situations like this," she continued. "They know how to protect both you and your mom, and they have ways of making sure that David can't hurt either of you anymore. But right now, the most important thing is getting you to safety, and that's what we're going to do." Margaret stood and moved to her desk, positioning herself where she could keep an eye on Benny while making the most important phone call of her teaching career. She dialed 911, her fingers steady on each number despite the adrenaline coursing through her system and the weight of responsibility she felt for this brave child who had finally found the courage to speak. 911, what's your emergency? This is Margaret Thompson, and I'm a teacher at Millbrook Elementary School in Portland, Margaret said, her voice clear and professional despite the emotional turmoil she was feeling. I need to report child abuse with photographic evidence. I have a 7-year-old student who has shown me images that document systematic physical and psychological abuse by his stepfather. The child is currently in my classroom and needs immediate protection. Ma'am, can you confirm your location and remain on the line? We're dispatching officers and Child Protective Services to your location immediately. Yes, I'm in room 204 at Millbrook Elementary, 1450 Southeast Morrison Street. The child's name is Benjamin Chin Williams, and the suspected abuser is David Williams. I have physical evidence in the form of photographs that appear to show ongoing abuse, and the child has indicated that there may be additional evidence at the family residence. As Margaret provided additional details to the dispatcher, the professional nature of the photographic setup, the psychological torture that had accompanied the physical abuse, and the urgent need for specialized detectives who could handle child abuse cases, she watched Benny sitting at his desk, clutching the folder of photographs that had taken enormous courage for him to share. The dispatcher was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about the evidence, the child's current condition, and the potential danger to other family members. Margaret answered each question as completely as she could while maintaining awareness of Benny's emotional state and the need to keep the classroom environment as calm as possible for her other students. Officers are approximately 8 minutes out, the dispatcher informed her. Child Protective Services and specialized detectives are also en route. Can you secure the evidence and keep the child in a safe location until they arrive? Yes, the evidence is secure and the child is safe in my classroom. We'll be here when the officers arrive. Margaret ended the call and returned to Benny's side, feeling the weight of what she had just set in motion. Within minutes, Benny's life would change forever. The photographs hidden in that manila folder would become evidence in a criminal case, the catalyst for David Williams's arrest, and the beginning of Benny's journey toward healing and safety. "The help is on the way," she told him gently, settling into the chair beside his desk, so she could provide the emotional support he would need during the difficult minutes ahead. "In a few minutes, some very kind people are going to come to our classroom to talk with you. They might ask you questions about what happened, but remember that you've already done the hardest part by telling me about this. From now on, there will be lots of grown-ups working together to keep you safe." Benny looked up at her with an expression of trust that was both heartbreaking and hopeful, the look of a child who had finally found an adult willing to fight for him. "Will you stay with me?" "For as long as you need me to," Margaret promised without hesitation. "And even when other people are taking care of the official things, I'll still be your teacher. And I'll still be here for you whenever you need someone to talk to or just someone who understands." As they waited for help to arrive, Margaret made a decision that she hoped would provide Benny with some comfort during what was undoubtedly going to be a difficult and overwhelming experience. She retrieved the small basket of books she had selected for him and placed it on his desk, choosing titles that featured characters who found courage in difficult situations. "I thought you might like to have these with you," she said. "Sometimes having familiar things nearby can help us feel a little bit braver when we're facing scary situations." Benny reached for one of the books, a story about a small rabbit who found the courage to ask for help when he was in trouble. He held it against his chest like a talisman, and Margaret saw some of the tension leave his small shoulders as he connected with the familiar comfort of a story. In the distance, she could hear the sound of sirens approaching the school, growing louder with each passing second. Margaret knew that within minutes, her classroom would be filled with police officers, social workers, and detectives, all working together to begin the process of ensuring Benny's safety and building a case against David Williams. But for now, in these final moments before the outside world intervened, Margaret sat beside her student and reminded him of the most important truth he needed to understand. "You are brave, Benny. You are strong. And you are going to be okay." The sirens grew louder, and Margaret prepared to guide her student through the next phase of what would undoubtedly be the most challenging experience of his young life. But she also felt a fierce satisfaction in knowing that the silence had finally been broken, that the evidence needed to protect Benny was now in the hands of people who could act on it, and that David Williams would never again have the opportunity to hurt this child or document his cruelty. The photographs that had been instruments of terror and control would now become the very evidence that would set Benny free. The sirens grew louder until they dominated the peaceful morning atmosphere of Millbrook Elementary, their urgent wail cutting through the ordinary sounds of a school day in progress. Margaret could hear car doors slamming in the parking lot, the measured footsteps of multiple people approaching the building, and the low murmur of professional voices coordinating their response to her emergency call. She looked around her classroom, taking in the surreal contrast between the normal academic environment and the life-changing crisis that was about to unfold. Her students were still working on their winter memory assignments, their innocent chatter about snow days and hot chocolate creating a backdrop of childhood normalcy that made the horror of what Benny had endured feel even more stark and urgent. "Benny," Margaret said softly, reaching out to gently touch his shoulder. "The people who are coming to help us are here now. Before they come into our classroom, I want you to know that everything that happens from this point forward is going to be focused on keeping you safe. These are good people who help children every day, and they're going to take very good care of you." Benny looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of fear and hope, the expression of a child who had lived for so long without protection that the concept of safety felt almost too good to believe. "What if David finds out that I told? What if he gets angry?" Margaret knelt down beside his desk, bringing herself to his eye level so she could look directly into his frightened brown eyes. "Benny, one of the most important things about the people who are coming to help us is that they know how to make sure David can't hurt you anymore. That's their job, and they're very good at it. David won't be able to get angry at you because he won't be able to get near you." The classroom door opened, and Mr. Harrison appeared with 3 adults who carried themselves with the professional bearing of law enforcement and child protective services. Margaret recognized the types immediately from her training and previous experience with abuse cases. a uniformed police officer, a detective in plain clothes, and a social worker whose gentle demeanor was specifically designed to help traumatized children feel safe. "Miss Thompson?" the detective asked, approaching with careful movements that wouldn't startle the children in the classroom. "I'm Detective Sarah Martinez with the Portland Police Bureau's Child Abuse Team. We received your call about Benjamin Chin-Williams." Margaret stood and moved toward them, positioning herself so she could facilitate the interaction while maintaining visual contact with Benny. "Yes, I'm Margaret Thompson. Benjamin is right here, and he has photographic evidence that documents systematic abuse by his stepfather, David Williams." Detective Martinez nodded and gestured toward her colleagues. "This is Officer Ryan Chun with Patrol, and this is Lisa Morgan from Child Protective Services. We'd like to speak with Benjamin privately, but we want to make sure he feels as comfortable as possible. Would it be helpful if we moved to a quieter location?" Margaret glanced back at Benny, who was watching the adults with the hypervigilant attention of a child who had learned that safety required constant awareness of potential threats. "Benny, these are the people I told you about, the ones whose job it is to help children who have been hurt. Would you feel more comfortable talking with them here in our classroom? Or would you like to go somewhere quieter? Can you come with me?" Benny asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled with the overwhelming nature of the situation. "Absolutely," Detective Martinez said before Margaret could respond. "Miss Thompson can stay with you for as long as you need her to. We understand that this is scary, and we want you to feel as safe as possible." Lisa Morgan, the social worker, approached Benny's desk with the kind of gentle confidence that came from years of experience helping traumatized children. "Hi, Benjamin. I'm Miss Morgan, and my job is to make sure that children are safe and protected. Miss Thompson told us that you were very brave and shared something important with her. We're here because we want to help you, and we want to make sure that no one can hurt you anymore." Benny looked from Lisa to Detective Martinez to Officer Chun, his expression cautious but no longer filled with the paralyzing terror that had characterized his demeanor for weeks. Margaret could see that the presence of so many adults focused specifically on his protection was beginning to register as something positive rather than threatening. "I have pictures," Benny said quietly, reaching for the manila folder that had required such enormous courage to share. "Pictures that David took in his workshop. Miss Thompson said they would help you understand what's been happening." Detective Martinez accepted the folder with the reverence appropriate for crucial evidence, her expression remaining calm and professional despite what Margaret suspected would be her internal reaction to the photographs. "Thank you for being so brave, Benjamin. These pictures are going to help us make sure that David can never hurt you again." As Detective Martinez examined the photographs, Margaret watched her colleague's face carefully. Even someone with extensive experience in child abuse cases couldn't completely hide their reaction to evidence of such systematic cruelty, and Margaret saw the slight tightening around the detective's eyes that indicated she understood the full implications of what she was looking at. "Benjamin," Detective Martinez said after reviewing all 4 photographs, "these pictures are exactly the kind of evidence that helps us protect children. You did absolutely the right thing by bringing them to Miss Thompson and trusting her to help you. Now I need to ask you some questions about what happened, but I want you to know that you can take your time, and if you need a break at any point, just let us know." What followed was the most professional and compassionate interview Margaret had ever witnessed. Detective Martinez had clearly received specialized training in talking with traumatized children, and her questions were carefully structured to gather necessary information while minimizing additional trauma to Benny. Lisa Morgan provided emotional support throughout the process, offering quiet encouragement and helping Benny feel safe enough to share the details of his ordeal. Benny described the escalating pattern of abuse that had begun shortly after David moved into their home 6 months earlier. The violence had started with discipline that seemed excessive but which Linda, working night shifts and exhausted during her off hours, had not witnessed. David had been careful to ensure that his most severe abuse occurred when Linda was at work, creating a situation where Benny's mother had no idea what her son was enduring. The photographic documentation had begun about 3 months ago, David explaining to Benny that the pictures were reminders of what happened when he didn't follow the rules. The psychological torture of being forced to look at images of his own abuse had been as devastating as the physical violence, creating a cycle of fear and shame that had kept Benny silent even as the abuse escalated. He said that if I ever told anyone, he would show the pictures to everyone at school, Benny explained, his voice growing stronger as he realized that these adults believed him and were taking his experiences seriously. He said no one would want to be friends with a kid who let those things happen to him, and that Mom would be disappointed in me for not being strong enough to handle our special time together. Margaret felt her heart break all over again at the sophisticated psychological manipulation that David had employed to ensure Benny's silence. The man had clearly understood exactly how to exploit a child's natural desire for acceptance and fear of disappointing the adults in his life. Detective Martinez took detailed notes throughout the interview, asking follow-up questions that helped establish a timeline of the abuse and gather information that would be crucial for building a criminal case. She was particularly interested in the technical setup that the photographs revealed, asking Benny about other equipment he might have seen in David's workshop and whether he had observed David using computers or other devices in connection with the abuse. The workshop has lots of cameras, Benny said, his memory becoming clearer as he realized he was finally safe to share these details. And he has a big computer where he looks at pictures. Sometimes I could hear him down there at night, and there were sounds like he was talking to other people, but I never saw anyone else there. This information caused Detective Martinez and Officer Chun to exchange a significant look that Margaret interpreted as confirmation of their worst fears. The possibility that David's abuse of Benny was connected to a larger network of predators would make the case even more serious and urgent. While the interview continued, Lisa Morgan worked on the practical aspects of ensuring Benny's immediate safety. She explained to him that he would not be returning home that day, that arrangements were being made to protect him while the investigation proceeded, and that his mother was being contacted so she could be informed of the situation and involved in planning for his care. "What about my mom?" Benny asked, the question that had been weighing on him since he first decided to share his secret. David said he would hurt her if anyone found out about the workshop. "Your mom is going to be just fine," Lisa assured him with the confidence that came from professional experience with these situations. "We have ways of making sure that David can't hurt either of you anymore. In fact, officers are going to David's workplace right now to arrest him, so he won't even know that you've talked to us until after he's already in custody." The relief that flooded across Benny's face was visible and profound. For months, he had carried the burden of believing that his safety could only be purchased with his mother's danger, that protecting himself meant putting the person he loved most at risk. Learning that both he and his mother could be safe simultaneously seemed to lift a weight from his shoulders that had been crushing him for far too long. As the formal interview concluded, Margaret found herself filled with admiration for the professional and compassionate way that Detective Martinez and Lisa Morgan had handled this delicate situation. They had managed to gather the information they needed for their investigation while helping Benny feel heard, believed, and protected, exactly what this traumatized child needed to begin his healing process. "Benjamin," Detective Martinez said as she prepared to leave with the photographic evidence, "I want you to know that what you did today was incredibly brave. Many children who are hurt the way you were hurt never find the courage to ask for help. But you did. You should be very proud of yourself." Officer Chun, who had been coordinating with other units via radio throughout the interview, approached with an update that brought visible relief to everyone in the room. "I just received confirmation that David Williams has been taken into custody at his workplace. He's being transported to our facility for processing and will be held pending formal charges." The news that David was already in custody seemed to complete Benny's transformation from terrified victim to protected child. Margaret watched as his posture straightened, his breathing deepened, and something that looked like hope began to replace the fear that had dominated his expression for so many weeks. Lisa Morgan spent additional time with Benny, explaining what would happen next in terms of his living situation and the support services that would be available to help him process his trauma. She assured him that he would be placed with specially trained foster parents who understood how to care for children who had experienced abuse, and that he would have access to counselors and therapists who could help him work through his experiences. "Will I be able to come back to school?" Benny asked, looking at Margaret with an expression that suggested her classroom had become a symbol of safety and normalcy for him. "Absolutely," Lisa replied. "Once we get you settled in a safe place, Continuing your education will be a priority. Miss Thompson has been taking very good care of you, and we want to make sure you can keep learning and growing in an environment where you feel secure. Margaret felt a surge of emotion at the implication that she would continue to be part of Benny's support system. Teaching had always been more than just a job for her, but her connection to this brave child had become something deeper and more personal than any student relationship she had experienced before. As the immediate crisis management phase of the response began to wind down, Detective Martinez took Margaret aside to discuss her role as a key witness in the criminal case that would inevitably follow David's arrest. Miss Thompson, your documentation of Benjamin's behavioral changes and your professional observations will be crucial evidence in prosecuting this case, the detective explained. The photographs provide clear evidence of the abuse, but your testimony about the impact on Benjamin's emotional and psychological state will help establish the full scope of the damage that David Williams inflicted. Margaret nodded, understanding the responsibility that came with being the adult who had finally given Benny the safety he needed to speak. I've been keeping detailed notes about my observations over the past few weeks. Everything is documented, the behavioral changes, the physical evidence I observed, and the progression of our relationship that led to his disclosure today. That kind of professional documentation is invaluable, Detective Martinez said. It helps establish a pattern and timeline that supports Benjamin's account of what happened. Your training as an educator and your experience with children will make your testimony particularly compelling. As the official response team prepared to leave with Benny, Margaret realized that this was a moment of transition that required careful handling. Benny had found the courage to speak because he trusted her, and she wanted to ensure that their connection remained strong even as other adults took over the primary responsibility for his care. "Benny," she said, approaching his desk where he was gathering the few personal items he would take with him, "I want you to remember that even though you're going to be staying somewhere else for a while, I'm still your teacher, and I still care about you very much. Nothing about that is going to change." She handed him the small basket of books she had selected for him, along with a handwritten note that she had quickly composed while the interview was taking place. "These are for you to keep wherever you go, and this note has my school phone number, so you can call me if you ever want to talk, or if you just want to let me know how you're doing." Benny accepted the books and the note with an expression of gratitude that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. "Thank you, Miss Thompson. You're the first grown-up who ever listened to me and believed me." Margaret knelt down and gave him the kind of gentle, appropriate hug that she had learned he could tolerate, feeling the way his small body relaxed into the embrace. "You are a remarkable child, Benny. You're brave and smart and strong, and you're going to have a wonderful life. I believe that with all my heart." As Lisa Morgan prepared to escort Benny from the classroom, she took a moment to speak with Margaret privately about the transition process and what would happen next. "Teachers like you are the reason children like Benjamin survive situations like this," Lisa said with obvious respect and gratitude. "Your patience in building trust with him, your professional instincts in recognizing the signs of abuse, and your courage in taking action probably saved his life. I want you to know that your work with him made all the difference." Margaret watched through her classroom windows as Lisa Morgan led Benny toward the car that would take him to his temporary placement. Even from a distance, she could see that his posture had changed. He walked taller, moved with less fear, and seemed to be engaging in normal conversation with Lisa rather than the careful, guarded responses that had characterized his interactions for weeks. As the afternoon progressed and Margaret's other students returned from their various activities, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary events of the day. Her classroom felt different now, marked by the knowledge that it had been the setting for a moment of tremendous courage and the beginning of a child's journey toward healing. The regular afternoon routine continued: math lessons, science activities, and preparation for dismissal, but Margaret found herself viewing everything through the lens of what had just occurred. The ordinary concerns of second-grade education seemed both vitally important and utterly insignificant in comparison to what Benny had endured and overcome. Near the end of the school day, Mr. Harrison stopped by her classroom to check on her well-being and provide updates on the situation. "The district's crisis response team has been activated," he informed her, "and we'll have additional counseling support available for any students or staff who might be affected by today's events." Detective Martinez also wanted me to let you know that David Williams has been formally charged with multiple counts of child abuse and is being held without bail pending his arraignment. Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction at the news that David was in custody and facing serious charges. Justice for Benny would take time, but the process had begun, and the man who had caused him so much suffering would never again have the opportunity to hurt him. As her students prepared for dismissal, Margaret made a decision that felt important for both her own processing of the day's events and for maintaining the positive classroom environment that had made Benny's disclosure possible. "Class," she said, gathering her students in their closing circle. "Today someone in our classroom showed tremendous courage by asking for help when they needed it. I can't share the details because it's private, but I want you all to remember that if you ever need help with anything at all, there are always adults who care about you and want to keep you safe." Jessica, with the intuitive understanding that sometimes characterizes children, raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Thompson, is Benny going to be okay?" Margaret smiled, feeling genuine optimism about Benny's future for the first time in weeks. "Yes, Jessica. Benny is going to be just fine. He's getting exactly the kind of help he needs, and he's going to have people taking very good care of him." As dismissal time arrived and her students began leaving for their weekend plans, Margaret remained in her classroom to complete the formal documentation that would be required for the criminal case. She wrote detailed accounts of every interaction she had observed between Benny and David, every sign of abuse she had noticed, and every step in the trust-building process that had led to his disclosure. The work was emotionally draining but necessary, and Margaret approached it with the same dedication she brought to all aspects of her teaching. These records might be crucial for ensuring that David Williams faced appropriate consequences for his crimes, and they would certainly be important for helping Benny receive the support services he needed. As the sun began to set over Portland, casting long shadows across her empty classroom, Margaret reflected on the events that had transformed an ordinary Friday into a day that would change a child's life forever. The reading corner where she and Benny had shared books and built trust, the desk where he had struggled to write about winter memories he didn't have, the spot where he had found the courage to share his terrible secret. All of these spaces now held special meaning as the setting for his liberation from fear and silence. Margaret gathered her belongings and prepared to leave for the weekend, but she knew that her work with Benny was far from over. She would be called to testify in court proceedings, would likely continue to provide emotional support during his recovery process, and would always carry with her the knowledge that she had played a crucial role in rescuing a child from a situation of unimaginable cruelty. But as she locked her classroom door and walked toward the parking lot, Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment that came from knowing she had lived up to the most fundamental responsibility of her profession, protecting the children in her care. The trust that Benny had placed in her had been honored. His courage had been rewarded with safety, and his silence had finally been broken. The winter evening was cold and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above Portland. But for Benjamin Chin Williams, wherever he was spending his first night of freedom from fear, Margaret knew that spring was finally coming. The long season of suffering was over, and ahead lay the possibility of healing, growth, and the kind of childhood that every child deserved, one filled with safety, love, and the knowledge that there were always adults willing to fight for their protection. In her car, driving home through the quiet streets of her city, Margaret Thompson smiled with the satisfaction that came from a job well done, a child well protected, and a silence finally broken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new students who might need her help, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that courage, both Benny's and her own, had triumphed over cruelty, and that justice was finally beginning for a brave little boy who had endured far too much for far too long. The shadows of innocence had been illuminated at last, and healing could finally begin.